So this is going to sound bad to say, but as someone in a position of privilege, as a straight, white, middle-class, American-born male,
Sure.
DEI can seem uncomfortable to me.
So it's called Lenses of Humanity, How Reflection, Connection, and Empathy Can Heal Our World. Throughout the book, there are highlights and examples of different types of diversity, but I start from a very psychological standpoint.
Welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Brandon Griffin and I am your host. In today's episode, we're going to hear from Dr. Kyle Reyes, the Vice President of Institutional Advancement at Utah Valley University. We're going to hear about his background, about the work he's doing at UVU, and then about his latest book, Lenses of Humanity, How Reflection, Connection, and Empathy Can Heal Our World. Kyle is someone who can approach diversity issues in a way that invites engagement and doesn't shut down the conversation. This is something that I think is really needed in the world as things get more polarized, as things get more divisive. So this was a great conversation. Give it a listen.
I grew up in Southern California to an educator mother and an artist father. And I start there because as I go through the book, you'll see that I wrote it from a very personal standpoint in terms of my own journey, chronicling my educational journey. My brother and sister were both brilliant and did really well in school, and I was kind of a distracted graffiti artist. I picked up the art side from my father and was constantly doodling and a little bit distracted. My grades weren't great. My first few attempts at college, I failed out. I got a cumulative 0.68 GPA after a few semesters of college, which is, people are always asking me, like, how did you even get that? I mean, how do you get a 0.68? And I said, well, that's where you pass one class each semester with a B, and that's usually my art class. Through a series of mentors and miracles, I decided to, my parents had different religious backgrounds, but I decided to do a religious mission to the country of Colombia. Came back, and when I came back, as is the case with many who do such types of missions, I grew up a little bit and started to take seriously those things that I knew I needed to take seriously. Got involved in actually cultural dancing. My background is Hawaiian, Filipino, and Japanese, and so I started to learn the dances of my heritages along with doing a degree in graphic design. And with that graffiti art background, I thought, how do I take this and actually have a career? And people taught me how to turn that to graphic design. And I will tell you, I worked at a company for a few months as an intern, New Skin. In Provo, a company in Provo for a little while as a design intern, and then decided I wanted a career in education. And that's when I talked to a mentor, and they said, you should try out Utah Valley State College. This is 2003, and go see what they're doing for underserved populations. This is a group that I really love to work with. So I went over to UVSC in 2003, and I volunteered for a summer with a federal program. And by the end of that summer, they gave me a full-time job, had me quit my job at New Skin, and they gave me a full-time job for $23,000 a year. I was about to get married, and I absolutely loved it. I got to work with students from low-income and first-generation college-bound backgrounds throughout the state of Utah. And shortly after I got the job, I enrolled in a master's program in educational policy. After a couple of years of that, was eligible to take on a new job at the university. And I'll say, it was about 2006 when somebody said you should go on for a Ph.D. And I thought, man, it was a miracle that I even got a master's or even frankly got a bachelor's degree with how, distracted I was. But luckily, I was able to get into a good program at the University of Utah for educational policy, specifically focusing on diversity issues and multicultural understanding. And from there, I was asked to start UVU's Latino initiative, and then became the student success and director of a Title III grant program. became chief of staff to our former president, Matt Holland. He was announced in 2009 to be the president, and shortly thereafter, he made a change in his office, and I was fortunate enough to be hired as his chief of staff. And so served with him for 5 years in that role, was headed out to become a professor in Georgia. And that's when they said, well, what if you stayed here and you became our first chief diversity officer and professor in the School of Education? And I decided to do that. So I stayed, and it was awesome. We were able to lead a number of initiatives and to have UVU be more inclusive and a more welcoming environment to all students and from all backgrounds. And then in 2017, the position of Vice President of Student Affairs came open, and I applied for it and was fortunate enough to get that. And then shortly thereafter, President Holland, announced he was leaving. We brought on a new president. She's outstanding, Astrid Tuminez. And I was serving as her Vice President of Student Affairs for 5 years until about 18 months ago, when she asked me to take over fundraising for the university. So my current position is Vice President of Institutional Advancement, which is a fancy way to say fundraising and alumni relations. And during that, I really have to pause here and say, I would not have actually written this book had it not been for President Tuminez. Our very first interaction, she said, "Hey, I heard from Matt Holland that you're writing a book." And I said, well, I was working on 2 different books at the time. One is come out because I'm a big nerd. I was working on like this Polynesian superhero book, and not really like taking it seriously, but kind of working on character development for fiction stuff. And I told her about it, and she said, no, I'm talking about your reframing cultural competence, reframing diversity work. And I go, oh yeah, lenses. And she said, I want you to finish that book. And I'm like, oh man. So it's been an amazing journey. And this August, the book will be available, and it's pretty amazing, this journey that I've been on. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's great. So from dropping out of college, getting a 0.68 GPA,
yeah,
to being a vice president of institutional advancement, did you ever think you'd be here? What, looking back on your educational journey, how did you get here as someone who had to overcome, the first couple semesters of college?
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's mentors and miracles. I mean, I don't want to, somehow paint the picture that it was this sort of rags to riches story. I mean, my mom was an educator. My brother and sister were both very strong in their education. And yet I still had this voice in my head that felt like an imposter within the higher education space. I felt like I was just an artist and wasn't academic enough. But a few professors along the way helped me see that my artistic ability was one way to tell my story. And so through my visual arts, later on learning the dances of my cultures, performing arts, all of these new platforms gave me a chance to sort of showcase, wow, I really feel empowered by the ability to own my story and tell my story. And frankly, a lot of the workshops I do for young people, even throughout the nation, as I've traveled and consulted and spoken, have been about empowering people to become the authors of their own stories and doing that in a variety of ways. And so I could almost point out along that journey that I just went through, a mentor or somebody who believed in me at a time when I frankly didn't believe in myself. And that's been the story throughout. And my amazing partner, Michelle, has been there the whole way, kind of encouraging me as well. We have 7 children. And so along that whole journey, we've, she's Navajo. So my children are Hawaiian, Filipino, Japanese, and Navajo. And we're in, Vineyard, Utah. We live in Vineyard and working on these efforts to bridge cultural divides, especially during years like this, where there's such animosity, political divisiveness, and we feel like we have a role to play in bringing people together.
I think that's wonderful. So I'm actually an alumni of UVU. I did my bachelor's in business management. I did my MBA, and that was wonderful. I loved UVU, and UVU is really interesting. Is it still the largest university in the state of Utah?
It is and people ask, what do you mean by largest? So we had this last fall, we had 44,653 students, and that's a head count. What that really means, let me translate that. That means we had about 32,000 students on campus, and
Mm,
then about another 12,000 plus taking concurrent enrollment in the high schools that were officially UVU students. They were getting UVU credit, but they weren't on campus. And so, yeah, a total of 44,000 plus. We are projected to grow even more this fall when so many other institutions across the nation are losing enrollment and even closing up shop. UVU continues to grow for a
mhm.
variety of reasons. So I'm glad you had a great experience, Brandon.
Yeah, and I actually started out as one of those distance education concurrent enrollment. I think I paid a total of $300 for my associate's degree, doing it as a high school sophomore, junior, senior. Got a scholarship through my bachelor's, went and did my master's. But something that's really interesting about UVU and is that I was a 18, 19-year-old student, and I was taking classes with 30, 40, 50, 60 year old professionals who are already in their program.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
UVU has just this diversity of people from, young college age people. They have people from different cultural backgrounds. And, someone like you who's in that position of helping bring together all these different kinds of people, is that the problem you're trying to solve? Because obviously with diversity comes all these amazing opportunities for people
for
with
sure.
various knowledge, various backgrounds. But obviously that's going to have challenges, because if someone's never been to college before in their life, or if someone comes from an underrepresented background, they're going to have different opportunities and different advantages, or lack of advantages than someone else. So how has your book addressed this, and how has your work to try to address this issue?
So what wonderful question, Brandon. It's at the core of what I do and at the core of my book. And what I mean by that is, um, I believe in human dignity of every person, every student that walks. I was a professor in the School of Education. Every student that came in my classroom, every student that walks the halls of UVU, I really authentically believe that they deserve a champion. They deserve an opportunity, right? Just as much as anybody else. But you're right. It comes, let's not sugarcoat it, with more diverse individuals, however you define diversity, right? Age, race, orientation, religion, background, income level. Um, you're going to have to, if you're going to champion them, that means you have to differentiate your championing, and you have to really understand this variety of populations in a way that says, oh, I see you, I hear you, and I'm going to validate your what you bring to the table. And um, there are selective institutions, right? These elite institutions who only admit a certain percentage of folks who have a certain GPA and a certain ACT or SAT score. And so what happens is the professors in those classes can speak to a certain level and just stay there and basically stay at that level and say, hey, sink or swim, right? You're paying a lot of tuition to be at this elite university, and sink or swim. The challenge for a place like UVU, when we admit students who are the top of their class, the presidential scholars, right? As well as the student who says, I'm coming back to school after 20 years from being away. And they're going to be in the same class, as well as another student who is a recent immigrant who said, I'm a refugee, or I'm an immigrant, and I'm trying to learn and catch up on the American educational system. And I remember one particular class in the School of Education where I had, you want to talk about a variety of experiences. I mean, it was age from about 19 years old to 62 years old. You're talking about people who've been professionals coming back. You're talking about folks who are single parents, people who serve in the military, people that were refugees, people that were international students. And it was interesting because as I looked at that class, the temptation for a professor is like, oh, it's so much easier if I just treat everybody the same. Like, if you just one size fits all and you all just have to, perform to the standard. And while I get that philosophy, I think if we authentically want to welcome the diversity and sort of lean into the richness of that diversity that the students bring, we have to get better at it ourselves as professionals, as staff members, faculty members. And so the book itself, Lenses of Humanity, was actually born out of this idea that, doing diversity work in Utah County has not been the easiest thing to do for the last 20 years. And I'm not blaming anybody or any political party. It's just the reality. People feel threatened when we talk about diversity. Right now, in this political year, folks are threatened by the letters DEI. Um, there's policies in the state of Utah now that are trying to push back against DEI movements and those types of things. And so, um, when people say, "Hey, how do you continue to show up for this work?" It's really hard to advocate for marginalized or underserved communities in the face of the majority wanting to always say, "Hey, what about us? What about us?" And I said, "Look, for me, this is not some woke agenda. I didn't write this book because I'm trying to have people, vote for one person or not, or this is about understanding the human condition and understanding at a really basic level how we behave and how we think as humans and why we behave the way we do when it comes to encounters with difference." And so the book itself is an invitation for every one of us to be a little bit more deliberate in terms of how we're showing up. There's four lenses that I talk about in the book: the inner lens, the context lens, the empathy lens, and the communal lens. And these four lenses, I extensively go throughout what we can do to develop those lenses. But the lens, it's not just oh, that's nice to develop. It's actually meant to improve our relationships, to improve our ability to work across lines of difference. And it's not with the goal of consensus. It's the goal of understanding. To me, humanity is found in the understanding, right? I don't assume that Brandon Griffin and I agree on every political issue. And frankly, that would be boring if we did. I think the
Hmm.
beauty comes in you and I differing, having a dialogue, learning from one another, walking away, not agreeing on some things, but respecting each other enough to say, "Hey, I really appreciate where Brandon's coming from on that." And I think that's easier said than done. And what I've tried to do in my career at UVU, and I think, frankly, by the way, UVU is the perfect place to be doing this work because it's not overly, um, it hasn't swung overly in either direction. I think we have tried to maintain that middle ground in terms of the majority middle of a more moderate approach to say, "Hey, let's not go extreme either direction here." UVU wants to be authentic in really, when we say we're open admissions and we welcome everybody, we want to be authentic about that.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful. So this is going to sound bad to say, but as someone in a position of privilege, as a straight, white, middle-class, American-born male,
Sure.
DEI can seem uncomfortable to me. And that's
Oh,
ironic because if someone has advantage and opportunity, why would they feel uncomfortable about having that advantage and opportunity? So I think it is a issue because the second you say DEI, things get polarized, things
yep.
get politicized.
Yep.
Instantly, you mentioned DEI or anything dealing with those dealing with those words, people get uncomfortable. So let me ask you this: is your book dealing with societal issues, or is it dealing with it on more of a one-on-one interpersonal relationship level?
Yeah.
Is it addressing the issue from this philosophical level, or is it actionable insights of how I can better help people who are different from me on a one-on-one
Yeah.
interpersonal level?
I love that you asked this. And I promise anybody who's listening, we did not plan this out, but Brandon asked a perfect lead into the structure of my book. So the book is 13 chapters. 12 of the chapters cover the four lenses. So there's 3 chapters per lens. And the answer to your question is yes, yes, and yes. Here's what I mean by that. Yes, each lens is explored from a what, so what, now what
Hmm.
approach of teaching. And so it's sort of this what from a philosophical, what is the inner lens and what does it matter that we constantly are reflecting on what we bring to the table, right? What does it mean for me to check my lenses? What does it mean for me to check my biases and my worldview, and explore why it is that I see the world the way I do, and how did my parents influence that, and my culture and my language and all that stuff. That's important to do. The second then chapter is to say, okay, so what? Why does it matter in the context of our everyday interaction, right? And then third is the practical. Now, here's what you can go do about it. Here's how you actually explore the inner lens. And so the four lenses, they also, I wish I could show this rubric here, but it's on a matrix. The inner lens is working inward at an individual level. Okay. The context lens is working inward at a macro level because you're trying to develop a greater understanding of greater context, right? Understanding of histories and diversity of stories, and really understanding, my goodness, I had no idea that people looked at these issues this way. And so let me go educate myself. That's the lens of engagement, education, immersion, right? But those are really filling the well for yourself, really understanding and getting that big picture lens. Then you move to the empathy lens, and that's really the lens on one to one interaction. It's the outward facing individual lens. And the communal lens then is the outward facing collective lens. How do we lift communities and groups of people? So, I mean, I do think, I hope that the book addresses everything that you just asked when you said, does it do this or does it do this? I think I've really tried to straddle that both and where I didn't want to stay in the philosophical world. I'm very much a practical application person, but I also didn't want to just throw out, the top 10 things you can do that basically we could post on LinkedIn, right? And anybody could do. I wanted to show that it was grounded in my own research, in my own sort of meta study of the literature, of my own experiences, and really lead people through that. I'll say this, Brandon, what you just said about, your own privileges and those things. My goal is that people who say, I frankly am kind of nervous to step into any conversation, any training, any webinar, anything that says the words DEI, because like you said, it's polarizing, but there's also an assumption that somebody in this exchange has to lose, like somebody has to lose in this whole thing. And the way I've approached this book is to say, let's all own what we bring to the table. And this book was never meant for you to start judging, oh, I think so and so needs to read this book, right? I think so and so. This is all about what can I do to get better at my human interactions? Because frankly, this book wasn't written for white, male, cisgender Christians to understand minoritized communities. This book was written for all of us to understand humans better and to show up better for humans.
Mhm. So this is really interesting for me because I am a professor of management. I study organizational behavior. That's essentially psychology, sociology applied to businesses and applied to organizations. So this podcast, Psychology of Business, I like to explore these ideas. And something that I teach in my organizational behavior class is the kind of core of diversity is personality. Doesn't matter if you're from the same family. You could be from the exact same family, but you're going to have a different personality. These are kind of these deep level, are you introverted, are you extroverted? But we have these external or more visible levels of diversity, such as our age, our sex, our sexual orientation, our, the things that we are born with. So in this book, is it addressing a specific type of characteristic? Because in Utah, you're going to have people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, people who are never members, people who are ex-members, people who are on the fringes. You're going to have white, you're going to have black, you're going to have English speakers, you're going to have non-English speakers. Does it frame it in specific terms, or can it apply to any different type of difference between people?
Again, really, really wonderful question, and one that I think is important. Anytime you're about to consume a conversation on diversity, it's good to understand where the facilitator, speaker, or author has already defined it in their minds, right? And so it's a really great question. I will say throughout the book, there are highlights and examples of different types of diversity, but I start from a very psychological standpoint. So the chapter 1 is all about how the brain processes safety, how it processes information for efficiency, safety, survival, those types of things. And so from chapter 1, my definition of diversity is all about unpacking what's in our brains, right? From just a base level. Like you said, my brother, my sister, and I grew up in the same home and literally approach politics and these issues from very different places. And so it's interesting because we have the same racial makeup, religious influential makeup, the same ethnic kind of sort of cultural influences and those things. And yet our own decisions in life path navigation and, right, nature and nurture, the combination of nature, what we bring, our own personalities, like you said, but frankly, nurture the environments that we've navigated. And I talk about how and why our behaviors shift over time. When we are very little, we are gathering data. A 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, they're gathering data about where they feel safe, where their identity is validated. They don't have the words to name it. But when they go to school and they're 5 years old and they show up in an outfit and they get teased for their outfit, they process that, right? And they start to say, oh, that identity is not safe here. Let me wear something else. Let me change my behavior to do something else. If somebody shows up and they're in the second grade and they have an accent and they make a comment in class and people chuckle because of their accent, do you think they want to raise their hand again in class to make a comment? No, they change their behavior. And all of a sudden they realize, in order for me to fit in, I have to get rid of this accent. And so it's diversity on any level where somebody has felt othered, right? If you have felt like, and that's why even in the sections where I touch upon privilege, I don't go hard nose into privilege. I say, look, we all have it and we all don't have it, depending on the context. And let's own what we have, and this is not a matter. I'll give you one example. My one of the stories I share there is my father used to tuck me into bed at night and sing me stories. He was an Elvis impersonator. My father was a Filipino Elvis impersonator. He would tuck me into bed, sing me stories, play the guitar, sing Elvis songs. I thought every child in America had that same experience. That was my norm. I thought every one of my classmates had a parent or guardian tuck them into bed at night and kiss them on the forehead, sing them songs, say goodnight, love you. I thought every child had that. I didn't realize that I had a privileged experience my whole childhood in that regard. And it does me no good to, like, I don't think anybody's saying, oh, Kyle, you're a bad person because your dad sang to you, or that your dad's a bad person because he sang to you. No, they're just saying, Kyle, you may not understand that your classmate, literally sitting right next to you, was worried about their parent or guardian hitting them, or was worried about not getting dinner that night because their stomach was growling, or they were wondering how they're going to get to school the next morning when their parents were working 2 or 3 jobs. Kyle, you didn't have to think about that at all. And you're not a bad person, but part of humanity is recognizing, hey, there's so many things where if we don't have to process it at all, then or we're in the majority because certain things we've been able to navigate, we're not bad people. And nobody's attack. Well, some people are attacking, but I'm not attacking. I'm just simply saying, if you are going to seek to understand how to show up with humanity for somebody who's different than you start by recognizing, you know what? I don't know what it's like to be a first generation student. And yet we have 37% at UVU of our students are first in their families to pursue a bachelor's degree. My mom got a bachelor's degree. My dad got a degree. I've had the privilege of not, wondering how to navigate college. And so I think sometimes we go down these rabbit holes or it's not we stay on the big symbols of the argument, right? Oh, racial privilege or gender privilege. And we don't really unpack the nuance of privilege broadly defined. So I actually try to do that throughout the whole book, on all the lenses when it comes to defining diversity throughout the book.
Thanks for sharing that. That's really insightful. So when your book comes out in August, I want to pick up a copy. I want to, explore the 4 lenses. I want to explore those different levels. But from a more practical standpoint, when this book's released, when people have time to read it, when people have time to consume it, what differences do you hope to see at the individual level? What do you hope happens at UVU? What are you trying to do? What have you been trying to do that has made it into this book? So what are kind of the practical outcomes that you've seen from the principles laid out in your book?
Awesome. Well, again, I don't want to take the rest of the time to answer this question because I could go through the entire thing in my mind of, well, at the end of this chapter, I invite everybody to do this. I think more than anything, if I were to, let me try to distill it down to maybe a few things. The subtitle of my book, so it's called Lenses of Humanity: How Reflection, Connection, and Empathy Can Heal Our World. Okay. So at its core, even though there's 4 lenses and you're like, well, there's just 3 things that you talk about in the subtitle. Anyway, reflection, connection, and empathy are woven throughout all of them, all 4 of the lenses. And when people say, okay, Kyle, I just finished my book what are the three takeaways that you want me to remember, right, from the book? What are the three things you want me? What am I gonna think, know, and do differently because I read your book? And I'm like, okay. First, I want you to recognize that there's work to do. There's work to work on your individual lenses, right? So that what I mean by that is we need to engage with difference more, and we need to lean into what I call in the book healthy dissonance, right? I talk about in a particular chapter that dissonance in music is meant to have us lean in, and kind of it jars us from the melody for a moment. It has us lean in, but we're seeking resolution, musical resolution in that, right? And I talk about Leonard Bernstein and West Side Story composition, where he introduces the devil's chord, which is this very jarring chord of sharps and flats. But the whole story of West Side Story is tension, right? And so it's going along, and then he introduces this devil's chord, and it's a dissonant moment. I think far too often when we're confronted with difference, a different opinion, a debate, somebody who challenges an idea, our fight or flight response is really it kicks in, and that's because of our brain. And that's why I start with the brain in chapter 1. But my invitation is in the temptation to do a fight or flight, right? Let's reframe that and just engage. Just lean into the healthy dissonance. Now, there is some dissonance, like if somebody's being abusive or they're just cussing at you or whatever, that's not healthy. And that's just outright, being a jerk. But if it's simply just an exchange of ideas and stuff, then lean into that healthy dissonance. And I talk about how much we grow from being challenged, right? We don't grow in our comfort zone. We grow from the times we've had to take a step and be courageous, right? Out of our comfort zone. And so, number one, I want people to feel like they have the tools to engage with difference successfully. Number two is, I would say, I want people to get into the habit and practice on getting better at analyzing, why did I react that way right now? Like, what do I know about myself and what I bring to the table that caused me to like have, my blood pressure just went up when that person said that one thing, but why? And that question of why, asking yourself why. I had a colleague who approached her teaching in a very certain way, right? It was like the syllabus was like, you cannot have any absences, you will fail. You cannot have any missing assignments, you will fail. And as I unpacked over lunch with her one time, I'm like, can I just ask you, your syllabus, there's bold, like exclamation point, underline, like you are communicating to your students that they cannot make one mistake. And yet life allows some mistakes, and life happens. And she goes, Kyle, I got to tell you, my dad never let me have excuses. She's like, I grew up in a household where it was like, do not ever give me an excuse, just get it done. And so I said to her in a kind way, and I said, but do you see how that's influenced your teaching? And as we talked and talked and talked, and she knew I was coming from a place of love, and I was coming from a place of like, I wasn't trying to criticize, but I'm like, hey, you've seen your student rating of instruction. Your students, they don't feel safe in your class. They feel like they make one mistake and and I was like, can we just try an experiment? Can we try to soften your syllabus? Can we try to soften your approach? Because frankly, life is going to present, yes, there's some deadlines, but life happens. And it took a couple of years, but I still remember before she retired, she was like, hey, I just want you to know that it changed everything to me. And I'm so sad that I went 30 years of teaching and I only changed the way I approach teaching in my last year. And it was this idea that, can we just become more cognizant of the subtle ways that we do things, but we don't even know why we do things the way we do? She was acting as a professor. She was just projecting no excuses because that's what her brain was hardwired to do from her upbringing. And I think the more reflective we can get on, why am I so impacted by that? And why did I react? And why, I think that is a really healthy exercise, because what it does is it helps us to take a beat anytime that we want to react or want to flee from a situation as well. The final thing I would say is what I've tried to do at UVU, and what I want people to be deliberate at, is how do we build community? I introduce a framework for community building that's built on my own cultural heritages. All three of my heritages were island people: Japanese, Filipino, and Hawaiian. They were all, each one is an archipelago of islands there. And so I talk about this idea that all of us have responsibility forwards and backwards: people that came before us, people that are going to follow us, and people that are currently around us. And so in the last lens, the communal lens, I have a lot of practice. That's probably filled with the most practical advice on what you can do tomorrow to build community with the communities that you care about. And I have so many communities I'm a part of. I'm a big nerd. I collect Marvel, and I have all these like vintage toys and comics. I have a cultural community. I have a religious community. I have a UVU community that I'm a part of. And if I want to be more humanity driven in my life, then I need to be proactively building community. And so when what after reading the book, you'll see all these recommendations, and I don't care which direction you go. If you want to build something for the next generation, or if you want to show appreciation to those who've paved the way for you to get to where you are, either way, you're lifting humanity. And that's why my subtitle is what it is: how reflection, connection, and empathy can heal our world. I think if we can develop, a stronger sense of constantly reflecting, if we can desire to connect with individuals and communities, and if we can demonstrate a greater sense of empathy, really seeing the world through other people's lenses as we get to know them, frankly, I do believe, and there's some evidence to suggest that we could change the world.
I think that's wonderful. So the story about your colleague really touched me, because I think it's easy to ignore criticism if it comes from someone who you don't have a good relationship with, if it comes from someone random online, if it comes from some anonymous SRI, student rating of instruction. It's like, oh well, I bet it was that student who was a slacker. But if you come to someone with a relationship, with this meaningful relationship, you can actually break these barriers of these walls that we have. So that professor who had been so strict with her syllabus for 30 years, you were able to break that down. And I think that's wonderful, because like it or not, we all have social identities. We all have groups that we belong to, and it's really easy to set up boundaries of you're in, you're out. But
Yeah.
the thing that pokes a hole in that boundary and allows us to see differences in each other, I think, is empathy. But it's
Yeah.
hard to be empathetic. It's hard to be kind. It's hard to be understanding when we're set in our ways. So I think this is a really good thing to reflect on yourself, because it's only when you humble yourself that
Mhm.
you're able to accept that criticism from other people. So I really like that example.
Well, and something that you touched upon, Brandon, I talk about in the empathy lens, and I talk about three key things that are critical for us to develop this empathy lens. I talk about cultural humility, genuine inquiry, and courageous empathy. And so again, you'll read the book and you'll see me go deeper into each one of those. But the idea is that cultural humility, it all starts with the idea that I actually believe I can learn something from this other human, even if right, we show up and I know politically what maybe where they stand. If I come to that engagement and I'm like, okay, I'm going to take them down, I'm going to take them down ideologically, I'm going to shut them down, I'm not showing up with humanity. If I go to that and say, yeah, I'm ready to share my thoughts, I'm also ready to authentically listen, but I actually believe I can learn something from this exchange today. That cultural humility is really difficult, and it takes practice. The genuine inquiry piece is when people say things that are initially offensive, right? People, one of the biggest questions I get as a consultant nationally when I go and visit places, and they're like, Kyle, what do you do when somebody says something that's very like racist or sexist, or even if it's microaggressive, it's a little bit like more subtle, but it's still something that's inappropriate. Like, you don't want to ignore it, but you also don't want to just blast them in the meeting, right? And I said, I'll tell you, in all of my consulting and in all of my practice, the greatest way to diffuse that situation, but still address it, is to just keep asking questions of clarity, genuine inquiry. I want to understand one of my former students, right? They're training to be a licensed educator in the state of Utah. And they say in a class setting, I'll teach anybody except those illegals. Okay. Now, my blood pressure starts to go up a little bit. My initial response is to like shut that down, call them out, embarrass them. That's my initial human response. But again, if I'm going to practice what I preach and start to actually practice this, it's like, Kyle, pause. I know why you're reacting. And then lean in with genuine inquiry. And so I asked the student, that's a very strong opinion. Can you help us understand where that's coming from? I'm not sure you realized how that landed with people in the room. I'm sure there's people that might have a response to that, but can you explain a little bit more of the story there? Because it sounds like it's a strong opinion. Or if somebody says something and it's, sexist, and they're like, ooh, I'm having a reaction to that comment, and I want to make sure that I have the right reaction. Can you explain what you meant by this? Because I'm not sure you meant it to land the way it did, right? This genuine inquiry clarity allows people to either say, oh, crap, I didn't realize, or if they reveal that they're sexist, then they go down farther, and at that point, you don't even need to like eviscerate them. You're just like, okay, and you just keep asking questions, and they have to dig themselves out of a hole. And so genuine inquiry has to be genuine. And then finally, this idea of courageous empathy is, like you said, it's hard. Empathy with people that are like-minded, people that share our social structures, it's easier to have empathy with them, right? For people who completely look at the world differently than we do, it is a little harder. And so the courageous empathy simply invites us to say, hey, even with somebody who really looks at the world differently or votes for someone else, can you try to understand where they're coming from and feel where they're coming from? And that takes practice, and it takes you to actually pause and give space for that humanity to come out. And you can still walk away disagreeing, but at least there's some dignity and respect there.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. One thing I focus on in my classes, and one thing that I teach is everyone has their own unique perception. You know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. So
Yeah.
nobody thinks they're wrong. No one says something that they think is incorrect. But obviously, that student was incorrect, and that may have just been because they don't have exposure to people, to people of different views, to people who fit under that status. But we can help people. So I think the idea of asking questions is great because, obviously if you are going to blast someone during a meeting, that can harm a relationship, that can harm the workflow, that can harm a lot of things. But obviously things still need to be addressed. You shouldn't just let things slide. So I want to turn the conversation a little bit more to your consulting work. So I am a business professor. The purpose of business is to be productive, is to make money, is to be profitable.
Yeah.
So how can we translate this into helping people be more productive? How can we help this? If I'm a manager interested in your book, why should I get your book? How is it going to make my people, yes, have better relationships, but at the end of the day, how's it going to make people more productive? How's it going to make my team better?
Great question. And I get this more and more because I'm now branching from the educational spaces more to business spaces, more organizations who are bringing me in on this very question. Yeah, for me, it shows up in two or three ways. Let me see if I can address these. First is there is I reference this in the book, the Sitna study of 2000. They do it every 10 years. But the Sitna study of workplace production and loneliness is interesting. Workplace satisfaction, workplace productivity. If you're a manager and you're wondering if your employees are quiet quitting, if post-COVID they are trying to find this remote work balance, life integration, post-COVID we have learned that workers, and when I say workers, I don't want to like have the pejorative like assumption. I'm just talking like frontline employees in any organization right now are thinking in more holistic ways about my mental health, about do I want to be here. And what's interesting about this particular book and what I reference in the book is when people are seen, heard, and validated, they're more productive. And I reference research that shows that, right? They're more productive, they're more engaged, and therefore they're more productive. If you're a manager and your employees don't feel like you're listening to them and their ideas and validating it and seeing them and recognizing them and giving them a break when they need a break and before they burn out, you could sprint to productivity for a short amount of time, but it's not going to last, right? So to me, it's about organizational culture that you're building. What are you trying to build when it comes to, if you want a culture of engagement, a culture of buy-in, a culture of ownership by every person that says, oh, line of sight, I see how my work impacts the bottom line of this organization, whether you're in shipping or accounting or whatever. If the culture is, we generate your, we see you, we want to listen to you, we recognize the richness of perspectives you bring, you are going to get more productivity out of it. Number two, one of the questions for higher education as it relates to business is, what are you preparing students for? Like, I don't love that, UVU or any university, stop with your woke agenda, right? It's like you're being too, and I was like, wait a minute. Business is telling us that they want graduates who are more globally savvy, who can navigate diverse teams and work collaboratively across difference. So the book really, if you're a business, leader or you're a business manager and you're thinking to yourself, bottom line, I want the best ideas and I want this business to thrive in multiple markets. I want this business to thrive across segmented populations. It behooves me to diversify my employee base. It behooves me to surround our teams with people who can bring in those perspectives from different markets and languages and ideas. Oh, and by the way, not only do more diverse teams show that, that improve business outcomes. Well, let me back up. This research I cite in the book is not that diverse teams alone lead to more productivity, meaning you don't just get a black individual, a white individual, a religious, this religion, LGBTQ plus, and then therefore they're going to be more productive. It's the diversity of identities mixed with the commitment from leadership to say, we now actually want to generate a culture where we want these different perspectives and ideas, and we're always mapping back to our why, right? We're mapping back to the why. What is at the core? And more businesses are moving from, and this, I've seen this trend in the last decade, moving from just, declaring bottom line, this is our profit goal, and to this is the kind of good that we want to put out in the world. And why are they doing this? Because they're recognizing that Gen Z, millennials and Gen Z, and definitely Gen Alpha, as digital natives, they are crusade driven. The young people entering the workforce right now, graduating from UVU, entering the workforce, are crusade driven. They have these influencer crusades. They care about more things, but they know less about the things than perhaps people who study something in depth. And so what happens then is, with a crusade generation, they want to go make a difference. And if an organization isn't satisfying that, like they don't see that they're valued, man, Gen Zs are hopping. They're going to hop from organization to organization until they find where they're valued and they're purpose driven. And so managers, if they can step in and say, gosh, everything from onboarding new employees to employee, input and feedback, to employee ownership, to how we engage them, to development, all of those things. Divisions of people and culture typically bring me out to their organizations, because they're like, we have to change the culture because we think that long term it's not gonna stick. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some of the ways that I've articulated how the book can help businesses.
I think that's great, because I like how your book starts at this philosophical level, but actually gives us practical insights, because it frames the question, and it shows us what the question is, but it actually gives us a solution or something we can work towards to solving that problem. So I think that's what managers and leaders are really going to be interested in is, yes, we know it's an issue. We know we need to solve this. We know we need to do better with our diversity, but how can we actually implement it? So I think those are great things because, yeah, people want meaning. People need meaningfulness in their lives, especially at work, because we're spending 8 hours a day plus at our job. So hopefully managers can do better at creating that reflection, connection, and empathy in the world. So I don't want to keep you too long. I think if I keep you longer than an hour, I'm going to have to pay your speaker's fee.
Oh,
But I have one last question, and this is
yeah,
more of
you're
a personal question for me.
sure, sure.
I'm an educator. I care about my students. I want them to be successful. And I actually was an adjunct at UVU.
Nice,
I taught in Illinois, and now I'm teaching in Alabama. And I've had the opportunity to go to Vietnam, teach Vietnamese students.
amazing.
There are a lot of international students, a lot of Chinese students, which is wonderful. A lot of students from Central and South America. And one question that I do have is, how can I help people, not necessarily just international students, just people
Sure.
from all different backgrounds? How can I help them, give them empathy, help them grow, but uphold standards of rigor in the classroom?
Yeah, yeah.
Because when I first started teaching, I got a slap on the wrist because my grades are too high, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because I want people to be successful. And this is probably
Right.
something you see
Yeah.
at UVU.
Oh, yeah.
But how can I balance this? How can I balance rigor with helping people where they are at?
Yeah. Remind me, Brandon, what years were you at UVU?
UVU from 20. Let's see. I graduated high school with my associate's degree in 2017. Graduated with my bachelor's in 2019. Graduated with my MBA in 2020.
Okay.
So really from 17 to end of 2020.
Okay. And the only reason why I ask is, so when Matt Holland first came to the university, there were people that were wondering, oh, like, here comes this BYU guy that got his Duke, education. Is he going to try to have UVU be closed admissions and, selective and all these things? And I remember when we first came up with the core themes of the university in 2009, right? This is like in starting. And it was, we wanted the university to be, we knew that our student success was at the heart of the mission. Okay. So that was our what. That was our why. Our how was engaged learning. So we talked about engaged in learning, billboards, engaged learning, engaged. But then this outcome of like, we wanted to be inclusive and also serious. And so I remember President Holland saying, we're going to be engaged, inclusive, and serious. And people are like, serious? Like, what does he mean? And we're like, well, no, but we're going to elevate the quality of education and rigor, right? And we're going to be inclusive. And I remember so many times people said, you got to choose one or the other. You can't be both. You can't continue to enroll anybody that applies and then increase academic rigor. And so that was a challenge we were willing to take on. And it was one where, from our faculty who said, some of them said that we couldn't do it, to, later on, President Jimenez came on board and she said, I love this. We're going to go, and it's all about include, engage, achieve. And for her, it was more sequential. You include them on the front end, you engage them, and then they ultimately achieve. But the idea is, how can we achieve excellence in the classroom and rigor and hold people to high expectations and be inclusive and welcoming and like validating and differentiating some of that. So a couple of thoughts. One is rigor is an interesting term because I think sometimes we say it frankly is easier for a professor to just have one assignment that everybody has to meet. Okay. And for different industries, you got to do that assignment. You can't have alternate assignments. Now, for accessibility services purposes, right, for neurodiversity, and when somebody has accommodations, obviously we make accommodations. But for the majority of students who don't have some accommodation need from accessibility services or disability services, what does it mean for us to authentically like read the room and differentiate the instruction? Here's what I typically lead with when I teach a class. Day one, when everybody talks about day one being the syllabus day, I actually say, hey, read the syllabus ahead of time. Day one is all about how we learn together, right? So the stage I set because most of the classes I teach are things like multicultural understanding, English language learner methodology for teachers, arts-based integration, some of these other things, or even intercultural communication within the communication department. I will sit with my students in a circle and just calibrate how we're going to learn together this semester. And so the reason why I share that with you is in that first session, we talk about some ground rules, we talk about some agreements, because I say, hey, we're going to get into some topics that we're not all going to agree with. But can we agree? Can we make some agreements in terms of our respect for one another and that we address issues, but we don't attack people? And what are some other agreements that we can have here that, and so the class comes up with some of those agreements. We then talk about participation styles, and I talk with them, and they take this little inventory, and I say, how many, go to this corner if you're somebody who just is always talking, you're always volunteering. Go to this corner if you never talk at all in the class, right? The quiet ones, and we have this different participation personality inventory. And I say, okay, so here's the challenge. Those that don't engage typically, thank you for being honest, I'm going to ask you to step forward in some things, right? And those that are always talking, I'm going to ask you to step back in some situations. So I'm asking you to start to get better at self-monitoring forwards and backwards on some of this. The third thing that we talk about in that first day is what it means to fulfill the assignments of the class. And in that regard, I mean, again, our disciplines may lend themselves differently to these conversations. So I recognize that. But still, like I say, look, for you to be successful in this class, this is the standard. This is what we have to get done. This is where, now, here's what I also know. You all have lives. You all have different things that come in. You all have different personalities and how you approach, some procrastinate, whatever. And I go, but here's the thing. What I'm preparing you for is the teaching profession. And the teaching profession requires that you do these things. And later on, you're going to need to, on your own, without the reminders from your professor, you are going to have to show up as professionals. So I said, here's what I'm going to do, actually. I'm going to treat you as if you were already teachers in my school and I'm the principal. And so when I give you an assignment, I don't want you to do the assignment because you feel like, oh, I have to fulfill this assignment to get my points for my grade in class. Pretend you're already showing up as a professional. And you're doing this because that's what professionals do. And when I ask you to do something, if you have questions or I'm not clear enough or you need to modify it for some reason, come talk to me. And I want you to get into the habit of talking to your principal or your department chair or whoever that is later on when you become a teacher, right? And so part of this is to say, I want to just reframe their entire notion of what that learning experience is. Get out of the classroom and let's start acting like professionals. I remember somebody teaching a grant writing class, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, like Kyle, how do I, like, there's half the class is not meeting their deadlines of the different, they're supposed to do a needs assessment and they're supposed to do a financial assessment. They're supposed to do this and I'm trying to lead them so that they can deliver a grant proposal at the end of the semester. And so we talked through, anyway, the next semester, I was like, can we try something different? And they went in and he said, okay, Dr. Reyes here, he runs a department on campus. He's going to give $1,000 grant, actual grant, to one team in this class. Here's what you're going to do. Here's the steps. You're not going to have like, oh, check-in deadline here, check-in deadline here for all 6 parts of the grant. We're just telling you, your grant is due this date. You work as a team and go get this, right? Every team turned it in on time. Every team turned in a stellar grant. Why? It was just, it reframed. It was no longer just, and so for me, it's less about like, oh, I have to coddle every, it's, have you given them the purpose and have you incentivized the why to the point where no matter their background, they can connect with some sort of like incentive, like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm in on this and I'll figure it out. Oh, and by the way, when I go to the real world, I'm going to have to work with diverse teams to figure it out. So I'll stop there, but does that help at all, or is that valuable at all?
Yeah. So if I had to sum it up, the thing that I can think of is that it's almost like you were clearing the road for them, but they still have to walk that road. Some
This-
people may naturally be able to navigate the road better than others, but if you clear the road or clear the path up the mountain and set people up for that, they can do the work. But
Yeah,
sometimes you may have to just set expectations. Say, okay, you're going to be a teacher one day. If you don't show up to class on time, you're going to be fired from your
you'll
job.
be fired. Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to be fired. If a grant proposal on paper, yes, it's nice to learn, but here's $1,000 and, I'll actually give you the money for your grant if you actually do it. So it sounds like some people may just need you to clear that pathway and they will do the work, but maybe point them in the right direction is maybe what I'm getting.
Yeah, and what I've learned is if somebody has a language barrier or somebody has look, just because I approach my classrooms in this way doesn't mean that there's, somebody's like, hey, I just like literally I've had students like I just had a loss in the family, or I just broke up with my significant other and I just need some time, or life happened. And I'm just like, hey, just like in the real world, when my staff has life happen to them, they communicate, we give it a beat, we process, and we find a way to have you still fulfill your job at the end of the day. But we recognize that life happens. So you are welcome to take this week off, but just know that I still need the project done because we still have that's still part of your job, right? And so that's where it's like the more we treat them like students, where it's like, okay, I'm trying to give you a different assignment so that because I want you, I'm trying to differentiate some things. I can see where people are like, Kyle, that's just too much work and too much coddling and too much like if the job if the class like give me an example of what's a final project that a capstone project that they would have to finish for your class.
Yeah, so one's doing just a analysis of a organization of
Yeah.
their structure and their culture.
Yeah. And so do they work as individuals or teams or both?
Both.
Yeah. So it again, right there, I mean, they've got a deliverable, they've got a deadline, they've got, and what's nice about it is though, you can do these checkpoint check-ins right throughout the semester of just saying, hey, you should probably be about here right now in the development of this, this cultural analysis of this organization. You can coach them along the way. And what I found is if I can move from the sage on the stage, right? The know-it-all professor who they're like, oh, I can't do this until the professor outlines every detail for me, to a coach, a professional coach to say, I actually think you got this. So I'm going to trust that you don't. And by the way, if you feel lost along the way, I'm here, right? But here are the expectations. Now, of course, throughout the semester of my 14 weeks, I have a curriculum. Like I have things that I want them to learn, and I've got examples, and I've got these things. But as far as what I've really evolved in my teaching in terms of like, I'm not giving a different assignment to every person just to accommodate their uniqueness. I think part of this is preparing them for the real world, and where I see that they might have a unique need to make a connection outside the classroom with a resource, I'll say, hey, I noticed, that you might benefit from connecting over at the Women's Success Center, or you might connect with the First Gen Center. You might be able to have you considered, working with this particular Veterans Center or whatever it might be. And again, if there's not a center, I just would say get engaged with other things at the university, start to feel a part of the university community. Because remember, they're navigating your class, but they're navigating your class as part of a larger navigation of the ecosystem of that university or college, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so your class is one aspect of it, but they're bringing to your class the stresses from navigating everything else. So I remember students of mine coming to my class all stressed out, but it had nothing to do with my class. It was like financial aid. It was parking. It was they broke up with somebody, right? And so then I come back to, hey, I want to recognize this, and I'm so sorry you're going through those things. And guess what? Let me tell you some stories of some staff members who've had that exact same thing happen. and I want you to be successful, and I want you to prepare, and you can do hard things. You can do this, right? And that's what this laboratory is for, the college classroom. It's a laboratory so that we can refine our professional, what it means to be a professional before the stakes get higher. So
Wonderful. Kyle, is there anything you'd like to leave us with before I let you go today?
no, gosh, I look at since my team is over alumni relations, you've now given me some. I'm going to have Candace Gardner, my associate vice president over alumni, and Renelle Lewis, our director, reach out to you and get your story to share as a tremendous success story. I've been so impressed. Even, I mean, again, just the questions and I know it was a random kind of outreach on LinkedIn and stuff, but I really I look forward to having us stay in contact and be a part of each other's network. And then when you're in town in Utah, let's grab lunch.
Mhm.
Come see the brand new Young Living Alumni Center that we moved into last year. And I just really appreciate the platform. Look, this is all new to me. I still have that imposter syndrome going through my head about writing a book, and is anybody going to even care? And so the fact that people have reached out based off my post to say, "Hey, we'd love to have you on the podcast," or "Can you come speak at this?" It's just meant the world to me. So thanks, Brandon.
Wonderful. So thank you, Dr. Kyle Reyes, author of Lenses of Humanity: How Reflection, Connection, and Empathy Can Heal Our World. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to the Psychology of Business podcast. My name is Brandon Griffin. You have a great day and happy learning.